somewhere in the Egyptian desert, roughly 350 kilometers south of modern Cairo, on the east bank of the Nile, in a desolate stretch of sand and limestone that lies between the cliffs and the river, there is a cemetery. The cemetery contains the remains of ordinary people, not pharaohs, not priests, not nobles, but the men and women and children who lived and worked and died in a city that existed for less than 20 years. And that was abandoned so completely that the desert buried it, and the entire civilized world forgot, deliberately, systematically, comprehensively forgot, it for more than 3,000 years. The cemetery was discovered in the early 2000s by a surveyor working in the desert near the ancient and long-forgotten archaeological site of Tel El Amarna, the ruins of the city that Akhenaten had built for his god and that his immediate successors had deliberately and systematically abandoned to the empty desert, the patient sand, and the profound unbroken silence of more than 3,000 years. It contained hundreds of burials, skeletal remains that had been preserved by the dry desert air with the kind of clarity that allows modern scientists to read the bones like a document, to extract from the calcium and the collagen a story that no inscription, no relief, no royal hymn was ever designed to tell. A story of lives lived and lost in the service of a vision that the people whose bones lie in the sand never chose, never understood, and never believed. The cemetery, discovered by accident, excavated with care, and analysed with the precision of modern bioarchaeological science, was not the burial ground of the wealthy or the powerful. It contained none of the elaborate tombs, the painted coffins, the gilded funerary equipment that characterized the burials of the Egyptian elite. The graves were simple, shallow pits, some lined with matting, some containing a few pottery vessels, most containing nothing but the body and the sand. The simplicity of the burials is itself significant. It suggests a population that lacked the resources or the religious framework to provide the elaborate funerary preparations that the traditional Egyptian religion demanded, and that the traditional Egyptian community had spent centuries developing. The workers and the labourers and the ordinary families of Amarna were buried, hastily, simply, without ceremony, without the elaborate and comforting rituals that their parents and grandparents would have considered essential for the journey to the afterlife. Without the Book of the Dead, without the weighing of the heart, without the judgment before Osiris, without the hope of the field of reeds. They were buried in the theology of the Aten, a theology that offered no afterlife, no judgment before Osiris, no weighing of the heart, no field of reeds, no resurrection, no hope of any kind that the dead would continue to exist in any form after the cessation of the Aten's light at the moment of death. The Atenist theology was a theology of the living, a celebration of light, warmth, growth, and the beauty of the visible world that had nothing to say about what happened when the light went out and the body returned to the earth. For the pharaoh, whose personal relationship with the Aten guaranteed his own divine continuation, the absence of an afterlife theology may not have been a problem. For the ordinary Egyptian, the farmer who buried his wife, the mother who lost her child, the worker who watched his companion die from the injuries sustained in the construction of the pharaoh's temples, the absence was not merely theological, it was existential, emotional, and practically unbearable. They were buried in the pharaoh's vision, and the pharaoh's vision, whatever its theological merits, and whatever its intellectual sophistication, offered no comfort to the dead, no hope for the afterlife, no promise of resurrection, no framework for understanding what lay beyond the grave except the absence of the Aten's light, and the silence of a theology that had nothing to say about the most universal and most terrifying of human experiences. The gap between the pharaoh's beautiful, theologically generous, and intellectually sophisticated vision of universal divine care and the reality of human suffering that the cemetery reveals is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a moral indictment, written not in ink on papyrus, but in calcium and phosphorus, on the bones of the people who were conscripted to build the pharaoh's theological paradise, and who died in disproportionate numbers and at disproportionately young ages in the process. The cemetery is the countertext to the great hymn, the unwritten, unintended, but archaeologically irrefutable response of the ordinary people to the pharaoh's magnificent vision of universal divine love. The hymn, that magnificent, soaring, theologically revolutionary hymn, says the Aten cares for all creatures. The cemetery says the pharaoh's magnificent, paradoxical, and ultimately tragic revolution. The revolution of universal divine love, of cosmic creative tenderness, of the God who sustains the unborn bird, of the God who watches over the chick in the egg, killed through malnutrition and overwork and inadequate care, a full third of its working population's children before those children reached the age of 15. The story the bones tell is devastating. The bioarchaeologist Jerome Rose, from the University of Arkansas, who was part of the team that analyzed the remains, described the skeletons as the most stressed and disease-ridden of the ancient skeletons of Egypt that have been reported to date. The painstaking, meticulous analysis of more than 150 skeletons, examined bone by bone, joint by joint, measurement by measurement, revealed a population that was chronically, severely, measurably, and, most disturbingly, preventably malnourished, not occasionally underfed, not seasonally hungry, but systematically and persistently deprived of adequate nutrition in ways that left permanent, measurable marks on the developing bones of growing children, children whose growth had been delayed by as much as 2 years due to inadequate nutrition, adults whose spines showed the damage of heavy, repeated, back-breaking physical labor, the kind of labor that comes from carrying stone blocks, hauling water, unloading boats, building temples at a pace that the human body was not designed to sustain, fractures, injuries consistent with accidents, degenerative joint disease in people who were far too young to be experiencing it. 1/3, a full 1/3, of the entire working population of the city died of malnutrition, of overwork, of disease, of the cumulative toll of lives lived at the physical limits of human endurance, before reaching the age of 15. 1/3, in a city that the pharaoh had built as a paradise, a theological utopia dedicated to the worship of a single God, whose light, according to the pharaoh's own hymn, sustained all life and cared for all creatures with the tenderness of a father watching over his children. The city was called Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, a name that captured, in a single phrase, both the pharaoh's extraordinary theological vision and the specific geographical reality of the chosen site, a crescent of desert framed by cliffs whose shape resembled the hieroglyphic sign for horizon. The pharaoh who built it was called Akhenaten, the effective spirit of the Aten, the god it was. Built for was the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, the sole deity in a theological system that rejected every other god in the Egyptian pantheon, and that replaced 3,000 years of polytheistic tradition with the exclusive worship of a single, universal, all-creating, all-sustaining, and all-loving divine presence. The visible disk of the sun, the Aten whose light fell equally on all lands and all peoples. The theology was beautiful, genuinely, profoundly, intellectually magnificent, and almost unbearably beautiful in its vision and its language. The hymn that expressed it, the great hymn to the Aten, preserved in the tomb of the courtier Ayat Amana, is one of the most magnificent, the most theologically ambitious, and the most poetically accomplished religious texts ever composed in the ancient world, a vision of divine unity and cosmic creativity, of universal care and the sacred beauty of the created world, of the intimate tenderness of a God who watches over the unborn chick and the sleeping child that anticipates, by more than 1,000 years, the monotheistic traditions of the modern world. And the bones, the silent, eloquent, archaeologically recovered bones of the ordinary men and women and children who built the magnificent temples where that theology was practiced, tell a story of malnutrition, overwork, injury, and early death that makes the gap between the pharaoh's magnificent, soaring, and theologically ambitious vision of tender, universal, all-encompassing divine care, the vision of the God who sustains the chick in the egg and the traveller on the road, and the pharaoh's grimly and irrefutably documented, archaeologically attested, bioarchaeologically confirmed, and bone-deep reality of human suffering, one of the most disturbing, most instructive, and most historically consequential contradictions in the entire history of human civilization. a contradiction that reveals, with the cold precision of scientific analysis, the distance, the vast, unbridgeable, archaeologically measurable, osteologically quantifiable, and historically documented distance between the world as the pharaoh imagined it and the world as his ordinary, voiceless, historically forgotten subjects actually daily and painfully experienced it, between the theology that described the Aten's care for all creatures and the reality that the pharaoh who worshipped the Aten cared, in practice, only for the Aten. The contradiction is not merely historical, it is structural. It reveals something fundamental about the relationship between visionary leadership and human welfare, between the beauty of an idea and the cost of its implementation, between the grandeur of a theological vision and the suffering of the people who are required to build its temples, fund its institutions, and sustain its rituals. The bones of Amarna tell a story that is not merely about ancient Egypt. It is about every civilization that has ever been shaped by the vision of a single individual whose conviction was so absolute, whose power was so unchecked, and whose theology was so consuming that the welfare of ordinary people became invisible, irrelevant, and ultimately expendable in the pursuit of a truth that the visionary alone could see. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand who Akhenaten was, not the romantic visionary of popular imagination, not the misunderstood enlightened prophet whose brilliant theology was simply too advanced, too sophisticated, and too intellectually daring for the primitive society that surrounded him. Not the enlightened prophet whose theology was too advanced for his time, but the complex, contradictory, and ultimately catastrophic figure who launched the most radical, the most comprehensive, and the most deliberately destructive religious revolution in the entire history of the ancient world, and who left behind, when he died after approximately 17 years on the throne, a kingdom in political and economic crisis, an empire in diplomatic and military retreat, a theology without a single surviving believer, and a cemetery, a silent, sand-covered, archaeologically eloquent cemetery, full of malnourished, overworked, and prematurely broken bones. You are going to understand the revolution itself, the theology that drove it, the art that expressed it, the city that embodied it, and the diplomatic catastrophe that accompanied it. You are going to understand what the revolution accomplished, what it destroyed, and why the pharaoh's own immediate successors, the courtiers, the administrators, the military commanders, and the surviving members of the royal family who had lived through the revolution, witnessed its consequences firsthand, and who understood, from bitter personal experience, exactly how much damage it had caused, spent decades methodically and comprehensively erasing every trace of his existence from the historical record, so thoroughly that the most radical, the most ambitious, the most culturally disruptive, and the most theologically revolutionary religious innovator in the entire history of ancient Egypt was unknown to the modern world, until archaeologists began digging in the desert in the late 19th century and discovered a city, a theology, and a pharaoh that the institutional machinery of the Egyptian state had been deliberately and systematically ordered to forget, and that it had, for 3,000 years, successfully forgotten. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin the story of the heretic pharaoh, the revolution that consumed his reign, and the civilization that paid the price. The man who would become Akhenaten was born into the most magnificent civilization the ancient world had ever produced, and he would spend his reign tearing it apart. His father was Amenhotep III, the pharaoh of the Golden Age, the builder of the Luxor Temple and the palace at Malkata, the diplomat, who managed the international system of the Late Bronze Age with a skill and a sophistication that no previous pharaoh had matched. His mother was Queen Tai, the commoner who had been elevated to the position of great royal wife, and who wielded a political influence that was recognized by foreign kings across the ancient Near East. The child who would become the heretic pharaoh was raised in the lap of luxury, in the painted rooms of Malkata, surrounded by the wealth of Nubian gold and Lebanese cedar and Afghan lapis lazuli. in a court where the greatest artists of the age produced works of such beauty and such refinement that they remain, 34 centuries later, among the finest achievements of the human artistic tradition. The Golden Age was the environment, the wealth was the atmosphere, and the theological confidence that sustained the whole system was the air that the young prince breathed from the day of his birth to the day he ascended the throne and began, with a determination and a single-mindedness that still astonishes historians, to suffocate under its weight and then to tear it apart. The Egypt that Amenhotep III had created was the most sophisticated civilization on earth, a state whose wealth, whose artistic achievement, whose diplomatic networks, and whose institutional complexity had no parallel in the ancient world. The temples of Karnak were the largest and the most richly endowed religious institutions in existence, employing thousands of workers and controlling agricultural estates that stretched across the Nile Valley. The diplomatic system that connected Egypt to the other great powers of the late Bronze Age, Babylon, Mitanni, Hatti, Assyria, was the most complex network of international relationships that the ancient world had ever produced, sustained by marriage alliances, gift exchanges, and the personal correspondence of rulers who addressed each other as brothers, and who managed their competing interests with a sophistication that modern diplomats would recognize and admire. The army was trained, the borders were secure, the tribute was flowing, and the Nile was rising and falling with its ancient regularity. Everything worked, and the young prince, who inherited this perfectly functioning system, would, within a decade of ascending the throne, dismantle every element of it that did not serve his personal theological vision. The young prince was not supposed to be Pharaoh. He was not the eldest son. That position belonged to Crown Prince Thutmose, who had been groomed for the succession and who served as the high priest of Ptah at Memphis, one of the most prestigious religious positions in the Egyptian state. Crown Prince Thutmose died before his father. The cause of his death is unknown, and the few traces he left in the historical record include a small limestone sarcophagus prepared for his pet cat, a charming and oddly poignant detail that tells us something about the prince's gentle character and his personal temperament, but nothing about the accident or illness that removed him from succession. The unexpected and historically momentous death of Crown Prince Thutmose was the hinge, the quiet, private, unremarkable hinge on which the entire subsequent history of Egyptian civilization would dramatically and catastrophically turn. A quiet, private tragedy whose consequences would be felt across the ancient world for generations. If the elder brother had lived, there would have been no revolution. There would have been no heretic pharaoh, no abandoned city, no erased name, no 3,000 years of enforced forgetting. The Golden Age would have continued under a pharaoh who had been trained in the traditional theology and who would have maintained the traditional institutions. Instead, the crown passed to the younger son, a prince whose temperament, whose theology, and whose relationship to the Egyptian religious tradition were unlike anything the pharaonic system had ever produced. We know almost nothing about the young Amenhotep's early life. The sources are silent, and the scholars who have attempted to reconstruct his childhood and education have been forced to rely on inference and speculation rather than evidence. What we can reconstruct from the fragmentary evidence, from the inscriptions, from the art, from the diplomatic correspondence, from the archaeological remains of the city he built, is that when the prince ascended the throne as Amenhotep IV, probably in approximately 1353 BC, probably while still in his early to mid-teens, a young man who had not been groomed for the throne in the same way as his elder brother, who had not been socialized into the priestly and military establishment through the traditional heir's education, and who brought to the pharaonic office a set of convictions and a temperament that the traditional system had no framework for understanding and no mechanism for accommodating. He was already different. The theological convictions that would drive the revolution appear to have been forming in the prince's mind during the final years of his father's reign, nourished by the theological experimentation that Amenhotep III had encouraged. The promotion of the solar disk, the Aten, as an increasingly important deity in the Egyptian pantheon. but exceeding anything the father had imagined or intended in their scope, their radicalism, and their destructive potential. The theological foundations of the revolution were laid, paradoxically, by the very father whose legacy the revolution would ultimately destroy. Amenhotep III had promoted the cult of the Aten with increasing emphasis during the later years of his reign, naming his pleasure barge the Aten Gleams, calling his palace at Malkata the House of Nebmatra as the Aten Splendor, building temples to the solar disk alongside the traditional temples of Amun, and pushing the concept of the pharaoh's personal divinity further than any previous ruler. At the temple of Soleb in Nubia, Amenhotep III had depicted himself worshipping an image of his own deified self, a theological innovation that collapsed the distinction between the worshipper and the worshipped, and that anticipated, in a cautious and conservative form, the radical self-divinization that Akhenaten would take to its most extreme conclusion. The father's promotion of the Aten was incremental, compatible with the existing polytheistic framework, and carefully managed so as not to threaten the established theological order. The son would take the father's cautious experimentation and transform it into something the father could never have imagined, a total, comprehensive, and violently enforced replacement of the entire Egyptian religious system. The father had opened a door. The son would walk through it and burn the house down behind him. The relationship between the two reigns, between the golden age of the father and the revolution of the son, is one of the most instructive examples of intergenerational succession failure in the history of human governance. The father was a builder, a man who understood the existing system, who valued its traditions, and who used his extraordinary resources to bring the system to its highest expression. The son was a destroyer, a man who rejected the existing system, who despised its traditions, and who used the same extraordinary resources that his father had accumulated to tear the system down and replace it with something entirely new. The contrast between father and son is as stark as any contrast in the history of the pharaonic state, and it raises the question that every civilization must eventually confront. How do you protect the achievements of one generation from the experiments of the next? The question of whether Amenhotep III and his son ruled simultaneously for any period, the so-called co-regency question, is one of the most debated issues in the study of the 18th dynasty. Some scholars, drawing on overlapping dates, what shared iconographic elements, and ambiguous textual evidence, have proposed a co-regency of as long as 12 years, a period during which the aging father and the young, theologically radical son governed the Egyptian state simultaneously, the father from the established capital at Thebes and the son from his emerging theological vision. Other scholars reject the co-regency hypothesis entirely, arguing that the surviving evidence is frustratingly, perhaps permanently insufficient, and that the revolution began only after the father's death. The debate remains unresolved, and its resolution, if it ever comes, will fundamentally change our understanding of the relationship between the Golden Age and the Revolution, between the father who built the system and the son who destroyed it. What is clear is that the revolution unfolded in stages, each stage more radical than the last, each stage moving further from the theological mainstream of Egyptian civilization, each stage narrowing the range of acceptable belief until nothing remained but the worship of a single god and the authority of a single prophet. In the early years of his reign, the new pharaoh promoted the cult of the Aten alongside the traditional gods, building an Aten temple at Karnak, the sacred precinct of Amun, in an act that was deliberately and unmistakably provocative, but that was not in itself yet openly or irreversibly revolutionary. The Jempa Aten temple at Karnak, built with the Talatat blocks that would become the defining and instantly recognizable construction technique of the entire Amarna revolution, was decorated with colossal statues of the pharaoh in the new Aman art style, depicting Akhenaten with the elongated features, the narrow shoulders, the protruding belly, and the heavy thighs that would characterize the artistic revolution throughout the reign. The statues were shocking, so far removed from the traditional Egyptian artistic canon that they must have stunned the priests and courtiers who encountered them in the sacred precinct of Amun, the very heart of the theological establishment that the pharaoh was preparing to destroy. The Karnak statues were a warning, a visual announcement that the new pharaoh intended to break with every convention that his predecessors had observed, and that the break would extend beyond theology into the realm of art, of self-presentation, and of the fundamental understanding of the pharaoh's body and its relationship to the divine. The theological escalation continued throughout the early years of the reign, each year bringing new assertions of the Aten's supremacy, new restrictions on the worship of the traditional gods, new constructions dedicated to the Aten, and new signals that the pharaoh's ultimate intention was not the elevation of the Aten within the existing pantheon, but the elimination of the pantheon itself. The Aten had been worshipped for generations. Amenhotep III had favoured the solar disk, had named his pleasure barge and his palace after it, had built temples to it. The son's early promotion of the Aten could have been interpreted as a continuation of the father's policy, an intensification of an existing trend rather than a break with tradition. But in approximately the 5th year of his reign, the intensification became a rupture. The pharaoh changed his name from Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning effective spirit of the Aten, erasing the name of the supreme god of the Egyptian state from his own royal identity, and replacing it with the name of the deity he intended to install in Amun's place. The name change was a declaration of theological war, a public, irreversible, and deliberately confrontational announcement that the pharaoh had rejected the god who had sustained his dynasty, funded his temples, and legitimized his authority, and that he had chosen, in deliberate and provocative opposition to the entire theological tradition of the Egyptian state, a new god, a different god, a radically unconventional god, a god whose worship would require the destruction of everything his predecessors had built. In the same year, or shortly after, the pharaoh made a decision that would irrevocably define his reign and permanently seal his historical legacy. He abandoned Thebes. He left the sacred city of Amun, the city where the great temples of Karnak and Luxor stood, the city where his father had built the most magnificent palace in the ancient world, the city that had been the religious capital of Egypt for centuries. And he moved the seat of government to a new location, a stretch of empty desert on the east bank of the Nile that had never been occupied by any previous dynasty and that had no connection to any previous god. The new capital was called Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, and it would be built from nothing, in the middle of nowhere, as a physical monument to the pharaoh's theological vision and as a deliberate, comprehensive, and permanent rejection of everything that Thebes and the god of Thebes and the entire theological system that Thebes embodied represented. The boundary stelae that Akhenaten erected around the perimeter of the new city, carved into the cliff faces at 14 locations around the site, are among the most revealing documents of the revolution. The stelae describe the pharaoh's arrival at the site, his discovery that the Aten had appeared there for the first time, and his solemn oath that the city would never be moved, and that he and his family would be buried within its cliffs. The language of the stelae is personal, passionate, and theologically uncompromising, the voice of a man who believes he has received a divine revelation and who is answering that call with every resource at his command. The stelae also contain a tantalizing hint of the opposition that the pharaoh faced, a passage in which Akhenaten describes the evil things that were said against him and against his father, a reference that some scholars have interpreted as evidence of organized resistance from the priesthood of Amun, from the traditional religious establishment, or from factions within the court who opposed the revolution, and who may have attempted to persuade the pharaoh to moderate his theological ambitions. The reference is tantalizing but incomplete. The stelae do not specify the nature of the opposition or the identity of the opponents, leaving scholars to speculate about the political dynamics that lay behind the pharaoh's decision to abandon Thebes and to build a new capital in the empty desert. The evil things that were said may have been theological objections, political criticisms, personal insults, or all of these. The text does not clarify, and the gap in our knowledge is one of the many frustrations of the Amarna period, a period in which the most important questions are also the most unanswerable, and from the traditional religious establishment, that the revolution was designed to overthrow. The move from Thebes to Amarna was not merely a change of address, it was a theological statement of the most dramatic and most consequential kind. By leaving Thebes, Akhenaten was leaving the sacred and deeply meaningful geography of the Egyptian state. The landscape of temples, royal tombs, pilgrimage sites, and ritual locations. The landscape of temples, tombs, and ritual sites that had accumulated over centuries and that provided the ancient, venerated, and deeply meaningful physical framework for the practice of the traditional Egyptian religion. The move was a rupture, a deliberate severance of the connection between the pharaonic state and the theological traditions that had sustained it, a physical enactment of the theological break that the revolution represented, a rupture so complete, so deliberate, and so permanent that the pharaoh included in his boundary stelae a solemn oath that neither he nor his queen nor his children would ever leave the city, an oath that bound the royal family to the new capital with a finality that left no possibility of return, no room for compromise, and no option for retreat. The oath is one of the most revealing documents of the Amarna period, because it reveals a man who knew, consciously or unconsciously, that the vision he was pursuing was fragile, that the revolution he was launching would be reversed if he showed any sign of weakness or uncertainty, and that the only way to sustain the theological transformation was to commit to it absolutely, irrevocably, and without the possibility of retreat. The oath was a statement of theological commitment, but it was also a political calculation, a recognition that the revolution could survive only as long as the pharaoh's theological determination was visibly, publicly, and demonstrably absolute, and his personal commitment to the Aten's exclusive worship was permanently beyond question or qualification. The moment the pharaoh wavered, the moment he showed any willingness to compromise, to moderate, to accommodate the traditional religion that his revolution was designed to replace. The revolution, built on the shifting sand of one man's personal conviction rather than on the solid institutional foundations of organizational capacity, community loyalty, and self-perpetuating tradition, on personal authority rather than organizational capacity, would collapse. And so the pharaoh bound himself to his vision with an oath that left no room for doubt, no space for compromise, and no possibility of return to the old ways that his father and his grandfather had followed. The speed of the construction was enabled by a technological innovation that reveals both the urgency of the pharaoh's vision and the scale of the resources he was willing to deploy in its pursuit. Traditional Egyptian temple construction used massive stone blocks that required teams of workers, elaborate transport systems, and years of quarrying and carving. Akhenaten's builders used talatat, small, standardized blocks approximately 52 centimeters long, 26 centimeters wide, and 24 centimeters high, small enough for a single laborer to carry, uniform enough to allow rapid assembly, and cheap enough to produce in the enormous quantities that the construction of an entire functioning city in the empty desert required. The talatat made it possible to build a capital in approximately 3 to 4 years, a pace of construction that was absolutely unprecedented in the entire long and architecturally distinguished history of Egyptian building, a pace that testifies to both the pharaoh's impatience and his determination to create, as quickly as possible, the physical environment that his theological vision required, and that testifies to the pharaoh's fierce, impatient, theologically driven, ideologically inflexible, and almost desperately urgent determination to see his theological vision realized before any opposition could organize, consolidate, and act to prevent it. The talatat had another consequence as well, one that the pharaoh did not intend and could not have foreseen. The small blocks that were so quick to build were also quick to dismantle. And when the pharaoh's successors set about tearing down his temples and erasing his memory, the talatat were removed with the same speed and efficiency with which they had been assembled, carried away in their tens of thousands, and reused as fill material in the foundations of new buildings. Tens of thousands of talatat blocks have been recovered from the foundations of later structures at Karnak and other sites. Buried face down, their beautifully painted scenes and painstakingly carved hieroglyphic inscriptions hidden from view, preserved by the very act of destruction that was intended to erase them. The Talatat are among the most important sources of information about the Amarna period, not because the pharaoh intended them to survive, but because the method of their destruction inadvertently preserved them. The blocks that were supposed to build the pharaoh's eternal vision ended up as rubble in the foundations of the buildings that replaced it. And the rubble, paradoxically, has told us more about the revolution than the buildings it was supposed to support. The construction required the mobilization of a massive labor force. Workers drawn from across the Egyptian state, relocated to the empty desert, housed in hastily built settlements, and put to work on a construction project of enormous scale and relentless pace. The workers who built Akhenaten were not slaves. They were conscripted laborers, managed by the state, fed from the state granaries, and supervised by the pharaoh's administrators. But the conditions under which they labored, the pace, the physical demands, the inadequate nutrition, are written in their bones, in the skeletal evidence from the cemeteries that modern archaeologists have excavated, and that tell a story of suffering that the pharaoh's magnificent hymns, his beautiful temple reliefs, and his carefully managed artistic propaganda never mention, never acknowledge, and were never designed to address. The gap between the art and the archaeology, between the images of plenty on the temple walls and the grim archaeological evidence of malnutrition, overwork, and premature death in the cemetery, is one of the defining features of the Amarna period, and one of the most instructive lessons it offers to the modern world about the relationship between official propaganda and lived reality. The art of the Amarna period depicts a world of abundance, storehouses overflowing with grain, cattle yards filled with fattened oxen, banquets where the pharaoh feasts on meat while musicians play. The archaeological evidence from the cemeteries depicts a different world entirely, a world of malnutrition, of physical exhaustion, of spinal injuries from heavy lifting, of fractures from accidents, of stunted growth in children, of premature death in adults. The two pictures are irreconcilable, and their irreconcilability is itself the most important fact about the Amarna period, the fact that all the beautiful theology in the world cannot obscure, and that all the magnificent art in the world cannot explain away. The pharaoh also married, early in his reign, before the revolution began in earnest, a woman named Nefertiti, whose origins are debated, but who would become the most famous queen in the entire 3,000-year history of ancient Egypt, a woman whose beauty, whose political influence, and whose mysterious fate have captivated the modern world as thoroughly as any figure from the ancient past. The bust of Nefertiti, discovered by the German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt at Amarna in 1912, in the workshop of a sculptor named Tutmosis, is one of the most recognized, most reproduced, and most culturally iconic works of art in the entire history of human civilization, a painted limestone portrait, a 3,300-year-old painted limestone portrait, of such extraordinary, such haunting, and such almost supernatural beauty, such refined elegance, and such haunting modernity, that it has become the symbol not merely of the Amarna period, but of ancient Egyptian civilization as a whole. The bust depicts a woman of striking features, high cheekbones, a long, elegant neck, full lips, and an expression of serene, almost otherworldly composure, and it has captivated the modern world in a way that no other artifact from ancient Egypt, with the possible exception of Tutankhamun's golden death mask, has managed to achieve. The discovery of the bust, and the controversy that has surrounded its ownership ever since, with the Egyptian government repeatedly and emphatically requesting and being refused. The bust's return to Egypt from the Neues Museum in Berlin, where it has been displayed since its controversial export, is itself one of the most famous stories in the history of Egyptology, a story that connects the ancient city in the desert to the modern politics of cultural heritage in ways that Akhenaten could never have imagined. The marriage to Nefertiti would produce 6 daughters: Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankhesenpaten, Neferneferuaten Tashrit, Neferneferuer, and Setapenre, whose names, whose images, and whose presence in the artistic record of the Amarna period provide one of the most intimate and most revealing windows into the royal family life of any ancient Egyptian dynasty. The family scenes that characterize the art of the Amarna period, scenes showing the pharaoh and queen kissing their daughters, bouncing them on their knees, sitting together in casual domestic settings beneath the rays of the Aten, are without precedent in the 2,000-year history of Egyptian royal art, and represent one of the most radical artistic innovations of the revolution, a visual statement that the pharaoh was not merely a distant, idealized divine figure, but a human father embedded in a web of familial relationships that were simultaneously political, theological, and deeply personal. The artistic revolution that Akhenaten unleashed was as radical and as comprehensive as the theological revolution that accompanied it. The traditional Egyptian artistic canon, the system of proportions, poses, and stylistic conventions that had governed the production of Egyptian art for 2,000 years, was one of the most stable and most conservative artistic traditions in the history of human civilization. The canon prescribed the way the pharaoh was depicted: idealized, youthful, muscular, symmetrical, timeless, a human body rendered as a divine vessel that transcended the specificities of individual appearance. Akhenaten, deliberately, provocatively, and with full awareness of what he was doing, shattered this ancient and venerated canon. The Amarna art style, particularly in its early, most extreme phase, depicted the pharaoh with features so distorted, proportions so unusual, and a physical appearance so far removed from the traditional Egyptian ideal of physical perfection that the statues profoundly shocked the 19th century European scholars who encountered them, and continue to provoke passionate and unresolved debate among art historians, medical professionals, and Egyptologists today. The colossal statues from the Aten temple at Karnak, the earliest surviving examples of the Amarna art style, depict the pharaoh with features so extreme that some scholars have proposed specific medical diagnoses: Marfan syndrome, Froehlich's syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, or other conditions that might explain the unusual body proportions. Other scholars reject the medical explanation entirely, arguing that the Amarna style was a deliberate artistic choice, a visual theology that used the distortion of the human form to communicate a theological message about the pharaoh's unique relationship to the Aten. The pharaoh's body, in this interpretation, was depicted as unusual because it was unusual, not in the medical sense but in the theological sense, a body that was different from all other bodies, because it was the only body through which the Aten's light was directly channeled into the human world. The exaggerations were not caricature. They were theology made visible, a physical argument for the pharaoh's singular and irreplaceable role in the cosmic order. The later Amarna style was more restrained, the exaggerations softened, the proportions normalized, the features rendered with a delicacy and a refinement that produced some of the finest, the most technically accomplished, the most artistically innovative, and the most emotionally expressive works of art in the entire history of ancient Egypt. The Nefertiti bust belongs to this later phase, a work of such extraordinary beauty and such refined technical mastery that it represents, paradoxically, one of the highest achievements of the artistic tradition that the revolution was supposed to have destroyed. The bust demonstrates that the Amarna revolution, for all its theological and political destructiveness, created the conditions for an artistic flowering of remarkable quality, a flowering that would influence Egyptian art for decades after the revolution itself had been reversed, and the heretic's name had been erased from every monument. The theology of Akhenaten, the system of beliefs that drove the revolution, that justified the destruction of the old temples, that motivated the construction of the new city, and that sustained the pharaoh through the increasingly isolated final years of his reign, was, in its essential content, one of the most extraordinary intellectual achievements of the ancient world. It was also, in its practical implementation, one of the most destructive. The great hymn to the Aten, composed by the pharaoh himself according to Egyptian literary tradition, and preserved in 13 columns of hieroglyphic text in the tomb of the courtier I at Amarna, presents a vision of the divine that is remarkable for its universalism, its emotional warmth, and its theological sophistication. The Aten is not merely the god of Egypt. The Aten is the god of all lands, all peoples, all creatures. The Aten creates the diversity of human appearance, the different colors of skin, the different languages, the different customs of different peoples, and presents this diversity not as a hierarchy but as a celebration of divine creativity, a manifestation of the Aten's inexhaustible power to generate life in all its variety and all its beauty. The Aten sustains the chick inside the egg, providing breath to the unborn bird through the shell. The Aten causes the Nile to rise and the foreign rains to fall, watering the crops of Egypt and of distant lands with equal generosity. The Aten opens the flowers in the morning and puts the animals to rest at night. The Aten is the author of time itself, the creator of seasons, months, days, and the rhythm of the natural world that all living things depend on for their survival. The parallels between the great hymn and Psalm 104 of the Hebrew Bible have been noted by scholars since the early 20th century, and the similarities are striking enough to have generated an enormous scholarly literature and a century of debate about the possibility of direct literary influence. Both texts celebrate a single creator God whose power is manifest in the natural world. Both texts describe the God's care for all creatures, from the lions that hunt by night to the birds that sing at dawn. Both texts present the natural world as a testimony to divine creativity and divine generosity. Whether the Hebrew psalmist knew the Egyptian hymn, whether there was a chain of literary transmission that connected the court of Akhenaten to the religious literature of ancient Israel, is a question that scholars have been unable to resolve, and that may never be definitively answered. The hymn also contains a passage of extraordinary theological daring, a passage in which the Creator God is addressed not merely as the ruler of the cosmos, but as the intimate, tender, personally involved sustainer of every individual life. The Aten provides breath to the chick inside the egg. The Aten warms the creatures that emerge from the waters. The Aten watches over the child in the womb and the traveller on the distant road. The God's care is not abstract. It is specific, individual, and universal simultaneously. No Egyptian deity before the Aten had been described in these terms, as a god who cared, tenderly, personally, individually, not merely for Egypt, not merely for the Pharaoh, not merely for the Egyptian people, but for every creature in every land and every climate and every latitude, with a tenderness and a solicitude that extended to the smallest, the most humble, and the most vulnerable forms of life on the face of the earth. What is clear is that the great hymn represents a moment of theological vision that was, in its essential content, centuries ahead of its cultural context, a vision of divine unity and universal care that would not become mainstream in the religious traditions of the Western world until the emergence of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in the centuries and millennia that followed. The literary quality of the great hymn deserves attention in its own right, apart from the theological arguments it advances. The hymn is not merely a statement of theological propositions, it is a poem, a work of literary art, whose imagery, rhythm, and emotional range place it among the finest works of ancient literature. The description of the world at night, the darkness that falls when the Aten sets, the lions that emerge from their dens, the snakes that bite, the earth that lies in silence, as if in death, creates a vivid picture of a world without the Aten's light, a world of danger and darkness that makes the Aten's return at dawn all the more powerful and all the more necessary. The description of the dawn itself, the opening of the flowers, the singing of the birds, the leaping of the fish in the rivers, the awakening of the whole creation to the warmth and the light of the Aten's presence, is one of the most beautiful passages of nature poetry in the entire literature of the ancient world, a celebration of the natural world that is simultaneously scientific in its observation and devotional in its intent. The hymn also contains several passages of remarkable and historically unprecedented theological subtlety and philosophical depth, passages that reveal a mind engaged not merely in worship but in genuine theological reasoning. The observation that the Aten has created a Nile in the sky, rain, for the foreign peoples who do not have access to the Egyptian Nile, is a theological argument for the Aten's universality, a demonstration that the god's care extends beyond the boundaries of Egypt to all lands and all peoples. The observation that the Aten has created the diversity of human languages and appearances is a theological argument against the ethnocentrism that characterized much of ancient Egyptian religion, a claim that the differences between peoples are not deficiencies, but manifestations of the Aten's creative abundance. These are sophisticated theological ideas that would not become commonplace in the religious traditions of the Western world for more than a millennium. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that lies at the heart of the Amarna revolution, and that explains, more clearly than any other factor, why the revolution failed. The theology of the Aten was beautiful, but it was also exclusive. It did not merely elevate the Aten to the supreme position in the Egyptian pantheon. It denied the existence, the relevance, and the right to worship of every other god. The temples of Amun were closed, not merely neglected or defunded, but physically closed, their doors sealed, their priests dismissed, their revenues redirected to the cult of the Aten. The temples of Osiris, of Isis, of Horus, of Hathor, of Thoth, of Ptah, of every deity in the Egyptian pantheon were treated the same way. Closed, defunded, their rituals suspended, their festivals cancelled, their priests sent away. The pharaoh dispatched agents across the empire to chisel the name of Amun from every surface where it appeared. From temple walls, from obelisks, from tomb inscriptions, from the cartouches of previous pharaohs, even from the name of the pharaoh's own father, Amenhotep III, whose cartouches were defaced to remove the offending syllable Amun. The erasure was systematic, comprehensive, and theologically motivated, not a political act masquerading as religion, but a genuine expression of the pharaoh's conviction that the very existence of Amun's name on stone was an offense against the truth of the Aten's supremacy, a spiritual contamination that had to be removed from the physical environment with the same urgency and the same thoroughness with which a physician might remove a cancer from the body of a patient. The scope of the erasure campaign is staggering when considered in practical terms. The name of Amun appeared on thousands of surfaces across the Egyptian empire, on temple walls from the Delta to the fifth cataract of the Nile, on obelisks, on tomb inscriptions, on the cartouches of pharaohs stretching back centuries. The identification of every instance, the dispatch of work crews to every site, the supervision of the erasure work, the verification of its completeness. These tasks required an administrative effort comparable in scale and complexity to a full-scale military campaign. The pharaoh commandeered and systematically redirected the entire administrative and bureaucratic machinery of the Egyptian state, the very same organizational infrastructure that his royal predecessors had used for centuries to build temples, conduct military campaigns, manage the economy, and govern 20 million people, to wage a war against a divine name. The battlefield was the stone surfaces of Egypt's own monuments. The enemy was 3 hieroglyphic signs that spelled Amun, and the weapons were chisels, wielded by teams of workers who climbed scaffolding, crawled into underground tombs, and labored by torchlight to destroy every trace of the god whose name the pharaoh had erased from his own identity. The erasure extended even to the plural word gods. Wherever it appeared in the inscriptions, the agents replaced it with the singular god, a linguistic intervention that was as systematic and as ideologically driven as the physical campaign of temple closures and name erasures that accompanied it. The revolution was not merely a change of worship, it was a change of language, a change of art, a change of architecture, a change of the fundamental categories through which the Egyptian people understood their relationship to the divine and their place in the cosmic order. And it gets worse, because the revolution's most devastating impact was not theological but economic and social. The temples of Amun at Karnak were not merely houses of worship. They were the wealthiest, the most politically influential, and the most institutionally powerful economic institutions in the entire Egyptian state. Institutions whose accumulated wealth, organizational capacity, and political connections had made them a potential rival to the pharaoh himself. The temple estates employed thousands of workers, farmers who tended the temple fields, herders who managed the temple cattle, bakers who produced the temple bread, brewers who made the temple beer, weavers who produced the temple linen, scribes who kept the temple records, administrators who managed the temple finances, and priests who performed the daily rituals of washing, dressing, and feeding the cult statue of the god. The temple economy was one of the largest employers in the Nile Valley, a vast, decentralized, institutionally complex system that produced food, distributed resources, provided social services, and maintained community structures across the entire length of Egypt. When Akhenaten closed the temples, he did not merely change the object of worship. He dismantled the institutional infrastructure that sustained the economic life of communities across the entire length and breadth of the country. The institutional disruption extended far beyond the temple economy in the narrow sense. The temples of the traditional religion served functions that went well beyond the performance of rituals and the maintenance of cult statues. They were centers of education. The temple scribal schools trained the administrators and the bureaucrats who managed the Egyptian state. They were centers of medical knowledge. The temple priests maintained the medical traditions that provided the only health care available to the Egyptian population. They were centers of social welfare. The temple estates distributed food to the poor and provided employment to the marginalized. They were centers of cultural production. The temple workshops produced the art, the literature, and the theological texts that constituted the intellectual heritage of the Egyptian civilization. When Akhenaten closed the temples, he did not merely deprive the Egyptian people of their gods. He deprived them of their schools, their hospitals, their social safety net, and their cultural institutions. The revolution was not merely a theological change, it was a comprehensive, systematic, institutionally reckless, and ultimately socially catastrophic dismantling of the institutional infrastructure of Egyptian civilization. The cult of the Aten that replaced the traditional temple system was, by comparison, a narrow and inadequate substitute. The Aten cult was centralized, concentrated in the new capital at Amarna, rather than distributed across hundreds of temple sites throughout the Nile Valley. The Aten cult was dependent on the pharaoh's personal authority, sustained by the pharaoh's patronage, rather than by the accumulated endowments and institutional traditions that had sustained the traditional temples for centuries. And the Aten cult served a narrower range of functions. The Aten temples provided a setting for the worship of the sun god and the glorification of the pharaoh, but they did not provide the educational, medical, social, and cultural services that the traditional temples had offered. The replacement of the traditional temple system with the Aten cult was, in institutional terms, a catastrophic contraction, a reduction in the administrative capacity, the social reach, and the functional scope of the Egyptian religious system that left enormous gaps in the provision of services that the Egyptian people depended on, and that the new system, smaller, more centralized, more dependent on the pharaoh's personal authority, and less experienced in the management of the complex economic and social systems that the traditional temples had developed over centuries, was neither designed nor equipped to fill. The numbers are striking, and they deserve to be considered carefully, because they reveal the true scale of the institutional disruption that the revolution caused. The Temple of Amun at Karnak alone controlled agricultural estates that covered thousands of hectares of prime Nile Valley farmland, estates that produced the grain, the cattle, the beer, the linen, and the other commodities that fed the temple staff, supplied the royal treasury, funded the diplomatic gift exchanges, and sustained the economic life of the city of Thebes and its surrounding communities. The total number of workers employed by the temple system across Egypt, including the priests, the scribes, the administrators, the farmers, the herders, the craftsmen, and the domestic servants who staffed the temple estates, may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands. When Akhenaten closed the temples, he did not merely change the religious landscape of Egypt. He disrupted the employment, the food supply, and the social structure of communities across the entire Nile Valley. The revolution was an economic earthquake whose tremors reached every corner of the Egyptian state. The cult of the Aten that replaced the traditional temple system was smaller, more centralized, more dependent on the pharaoh's personal authority, and less capable of providing the economic and social services that the traditional temples had offered. The Aten temples at Amarna were built on a different architectural model. Open-air structures, roofless, flooded with sunlight, designed to allow the rays of the Aten to fall directly on the offering tables without the mediation of walls or ceilings. The traditional Egyptian temple was a journey from light into darkness, a sequence of increasingly enclosed spaces leading to the inner sanctum, where the god's image resided in permanent shadow, visible only to the priests who tended it. The Aten temple was the opposite, a journey into ever greater openness, a celebration of transparency, visibility, and the unmediated encounter between the worshipper and the divine that was, in its architectural conception, a physical argument for the transparency and universality of the Aten's power. The architecture was theologically brilliant, but it was also practically problematic, because the open-air design exposed the food offerings to the full heat of the Egyptian sun, making the redistribution of offering food to the temple staff a practice that was central to the economics of the traditional temple system, difficult or impossible. The artistic revolution that accompanied the theological revolution was equally radical and equally disturbing to the Egyptian mainstream. The Amarna art style replaced the idealized perfection of the traditional Egyptian canon with a radically new aesthetic, shocking to traditional sensibilities, provocative in its departures from convention, that depicted the pharaoh with a dramatically elongated skull, a narrow face, heavy-lidded eyes, full lips, a long thin neck, narrow shoulders, a concave chest, a protruding belly, wide hips, and heavy thighs. The departures from the traditional canon were so extreme that scholars have debated for more than a century whether they depict a genuine physical condition, a genetic disorder, a hormonal imbalance, or a deliberate, ideologically motivated, and theologically calculated artistic choice designed to make a specific and revolutionary theological point about the pharaoh's unique relationship to the Aten. The debate remains unresolved. The skeleton found in tomb KV55 in the Valley of the Kings, which some scholars have tentatively identified as Akhenaten's remains, does not conclusively match the extreme proportions of the Amarna artistic representations, and the identification itself remains hotly disputed among scholars on the grounds that the skeleton appears to be that of a younger man than Akhenaten would have been at the time of his death. The loss of the traditional afterlife beliefs was the most devastating consequence of the revolution for the ordinary Egyptian. The traditional Egyptian religion provided an elaborate, detailed, and deeply comforting framework for understanding death, a mythology of judgment, resurrection, and eternal life that involved specific rituals, specific texts, specific objects, and specific beliefs that gave every Egyptian a sense of control over the most terrifying of human experiences: the Book of the Dead, the Field of Reeds, the weighing of the heart against the feather of Mat, the journey through the underworld, the judgment before Osiris. These were not peripheral beliefs. They were the central organizing principles of the Egyptian religious system, the beliefs that motivated the tomb building, the mummification, the funerary rituals, and the offering cults that consumed an enormous portion of the Egyptian economy. By some estimates, as much as 1/3 of the total economic output of the Egyptian state was directed toward funerary preparations of one kind or another, and that occupied a central place in the daily thoughts and the daily anxieties of the Egyptian people. Akhenaten's theology offered nothing to replace them. The religion of the Aten focused exclusively on the living world, on the light of the sun, on the beauty of creation, on the pharaoh's role as the sole mediator between the Aten and humanity. For the ordinary Egyptian, the farmer, the craftsman, the mother who had lost a child, the removal of the afterlife beliefs was not merely a theological inconvenience. It was an existential catastrophe, the destruction, the sudden, enforced, state-mandated destruction of the hope that made death bearable and the framework that gave life meaning and death dignity. The archaeological evidence from the Amarna cemeteries confirms this interpretation. The burials at Amarna are notably simpler than contemporaneous burials at other Egyptian sites, lacking the elaborate funerary equipment, the painted coffins, the amulets, the shabtis, and the other objects that the traditional Egyptian funerary tradition prescribed. Some burials contain almost nothing, just the body, wrapped in linen, placed in a shallow grave, with no objects, no texts, and no ritual preparations that would suggest the deceased expected or hoped for an afterlife of any kind. The simplicity of the burials is consistent with a population that had been suddenly, forcibly, and comprehensively deprived of the traditional afterlife beliefs and traditional funerary practices, and that had not been given a satisfactory alternative, a population that faced death without the comfort, the structure, and the hope that 3,000 years of Egyptian funerary tradition had provided. The contrast with the royal tomb that Akhenaten prepared for himself in the eastern cliffs of Amarna is instructive. The royal tomb, though it was never completed and though its recreation is fragmentary, includes scenes that appear to depict the death and mourning of the Princess Meketaten, the pharaoh's second daughter, who apparently died sometime around the 12th year of the reign. The mourning scenes are unusually emotional, showing the pharaoh and queen in attitudes of genuine grief, with raised arms and bowed heads, in a departure from the traditional Egyptian convention of depicting the royal family in postures of divine composure. The death of Meketaten may have been one of the personal tragedies that marked the later years of Akhenaten's reign, and the emotional intensity of the mourning scenes suggests that the pharaoh, for all his theological certainty, was not immune to the grief that the loss of a child inflicts on every parent, regardless of their beliefs about the nature of the divine. The city of Akhenaten, the physical embodiment of the revolution, the capital that was supposed to replace Thebes as the center of the Egyptian state, is today one of the most important, the most extensively excavated, and the most archaeologically revealing sites in the entire history of Egyptological research. The site, known to modern scholars as Tel El Amarna or simply Amarna, was first investigated by the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie in 1891 and 1892. A pioneering excavation that uncovered the first systematic evidence of the city's layout, its residential areas, and its industrial quarters. And that established the importance of the site as one of the most significant archaeological resources in the entire Nile Valley. And that laid the foundations for the subsequent work of Norman de Garis Davies, who documented the tombs of the Amarna nobles in a series of publications between 1903 and 1908, and of Ludwig Borchardt, whose German expedition between 1911 and 1914 produced the discovery of the Nefertiti bust and a wealth of other material, including the famous workshop where the bust was found, identified by a small ivory horse blinker inscribed with the sculptor Thutmose's name, that transformed the study of the Amarna period from a marginal specialization within Egyptology into one of the most intensely studied and most widely discussed chapters of ancient history. The subsequent archaeological work at the site, by the Egypt Exploration Society under John Pendlebury in the 1930s, by the Egyptian Antiquities Service, and by the ongoing Amarna project under the direction of Barry Kemp from the University of Cambridge, has deepened and refined our understanding of the city and its population in ways that the early excavators could not have imagined. The application of modern archaeological techniques, bioarchaeology, ceramic analysis, spatial analysis, environmental archaeology, and the study of animal and plant remains, has produced a picture of life at Amarna that is far more detailed, far more nuanced, and far more disturbing than the picture that the monumental architecture and the royal art alone would suggest. The modern excavations have revealed not merely the temples and the palaces that the pharaoh built, but the ordinary lives of the ordinary people who lived in the shadow of those monuments, their faint health, their diet, their work, their religious practices, and their deaths. The excavations revealed a city that was unlike any other ancient Egyptian settlement, a city that had been designed from scratch, built in a few years, occupied for perhaps 15 years, and then abandoned so completely that the desert preserved it in a state of remarkable archaeological clarity. The preservation was a consequence of the abandonment, because Amarna was occupied for such a short period and then left to the sand. The archaeological layers are remarkably clean and undisturbed, the stratigraphy is clean, and the material remains of a single generation's life are preserved with a detail and an immediacy that no other Egyptian site can match. The site's preservation is also a consequence of its location. Built on the desert margin rather than on the Nile floodplain, Amarna was not subject to the annual flooding that had destroyed so many other Egyptian sites, and the arid desert climate minimized the biological decay that would have consumed the mud brick structures in a more humid environment. Amarna is a time capsule, a snapshot of a single moment in history, frozen in mud brick and painted plaster and broken pottery and the bones of the people who lived there. The city was laid out along a central axis, the Royal Road, as scholars have named it, that ran roughly north to south, connecting the major monumental buildings of the central city. The Great Aten Temple, the most important religious structure of the revolution, a vast open-air precinct filled with hundreds of offering tables arranged in long rows beneath the open sky. The small Aten Temple, a more intimate structure that may have served as the pharaoh's personal place of worship. The Great Palace, a sprawling administrative complex that housed the offices and the audience halls of the Egyptian state, and the administrative buildings in the central city, to the residential neighborhoods that spread out on either side. The residential areas provide an unprecedented view of Egyptian social stratification, from the large, well-appointed villas of the wealthy officials who followed the pharaoh from Thebes, with their spacious rooms and their painted walls and their private chapels, to the modest, mud-brick dwellings of the workers and the poor, with their cramped quarters and their meagre furnishings and their evidence of lives lived at the margins of subsistence. A social contrast that mirrors, in physical form, the theological contrast between the pharaoh's vision of universal divine care and the reality of differential access to the blessings that the Aten was supposed to provide. The archaeology of the ordinary houses at Amarna has revealed details of daily life that are invisible in the monumental art of the period. The kitchens with their bread ovens and grinding stones, the storage jars that held the grain and the beer and the dried fish that constituted the basic diet of the working population, the loom weights that indicate textile production in the home, the spindle whorls and the needles and the small tools of domestic industry, the children's toys, clay figurines of animals, balls of painted leather, wooden dolls, that provide a poignant glimpse of childhood in a city that the pharaoh had designed as a paradise, but that the children who lived there experienced as something considerably less. The workers' village at Amarna, a planned settlement on the eastern edge of the city, enclosed by a wall and accessible through a single gate, is one of the most informative archaeological sites for the study of working-class life in ancient Egypt. The village housed the workers who built and decorated the royal tombs in the eastern cliffs, specialized craftsmen whose skills were essential to the revolution, but whose living conditions were far removed from the theological paradise that the pharaoh's magnificent, theologically sophisticated, poetically accomplished, and intellectually dazzling hymns described. The houses in the workers' village are small, uniform, and arranged in regular rows, a layout that reflects centralized planning and institutional management rather than organic growth and individual choice. The material remains found in the village, the pottery, the tools, the food remains, the small household objects, provide a detailed picture of daily life at Amarna that is at once fascinating and deeply, deeply troubling, providing a counter-narrative to the official art of the Amarna period that is as devastating as it is illuminating. The health evidence from the Amarna cemeteries, studied by bioarchaeologists including Gretchen Dabbs and Jerome Rose, has painted a picture of life at Amarna that contradicts the official imagery of abundance and divine care. The meticulous, bone-by-bone analysis of skeletal remains from the South Tomb Cemetery, the largest, the most extensively excavated, and the most archaeologically informative of the Amarna cemeteries, containing hundreds of burials, found evidence of chronic malnutrition, with children's growth delayed by as much as 2 years compared to expected developmental standards. The adults showed high rates of degenerative spinal disease, evidence of heavy, repeated physical labor that had damaged the vertebrae and the intervertebral discs of workers who were, in many cases, still in their teens or 20s. Fracture rates were high, consistent with a population engaged in heavy construction work under conditions of physical stress and inadequate nutrition, and the age-at-death profiles were striking. A deeply troubling and disproportionate number of individuals died young, far younger than the population averages at comparable Egyptian sites, with approximately one-third of the population dying before the age of 15. The picture that emerges from the bones is not of a population living in the theological paradise that the pharaoh's soaring, exquisitely crafted, literally accomplished, magnificently composed, and theologically sophisticated hymns so eloquently, so passionately, and so beautifully described. It is instead a picture of a population that was chronically overworked, systematically underfed, physically stressed, and dying at rates that suggest conditions considerably worse than those at other contemporaneous Egyptian sites. The significance of this evidence cannot be overstated. The workers whose bones lie in the Amarna cemeteries were the people who built the pharaoh's theological utopia, the people who carried the talatat blocks, who mixed the mud brick for the residential quarters, who hauled the water and the food and the building materials, the construction of an entire city from nothing required. They were the human cost of the revolution, the laborers whose physical suffering was the price of the pharaoh's vision, and whose premature, medically documented, osteologically recorded, and archaeologically verified deaths were the collateral damage, the unacknowledged, unrecorded, and an unlamented collateral damage of the pharaoh's determination to see that vision realized in stone and mud brick and painted plaster before any opposition could organize to prevent it. The North Palace at Amarna, a structure that may have served as a royal retreat or as a residence for one of the royal women, contains some of the most exquisite paintings to survive from the rich ancient world. The painted murals depicted birds in flight, papyrus marshes, and scenes from the natural world rendered with a freshness of observation, a delicacy of colour, and a naturalistic attention to botanical and zoological detail that have no parallel in the earlier or later artistic traditions of Egypt. The paintings demonstrate that the Amarna Revolution, for all its theological and political destructiveness, created the conditions for an artistic flowering of extraordinary quality, a flowering that produced, in the brief span of the revolution's lifetime, works of art that rival the finest productions of any ancient civilization, and that represent, paradoxically, one of the most enduring and most celebrated legacies of a reign that was otherwise characterized by institutional destruction, diplomatic neglect, and human suffering. The most revealing feature of the workers' village, and one that directly contradicts the pharaoh's theological vision, is the evidence of persistent traditional shape in the private sphere. Excavations of the residential areas at Amarna have uncovered household shrines dedicated to traditional deities. Small images of Bes, the dwarf god of household protection, and Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth and fertility, that the pharaoh's sweeping, comprehensive, publicly enforced, and institutionally mandated theological revolution had officially and emphatically banned from public worship, but that the people had continued to worship in the privacy of their homes, behind closed doors, in the spaces where the pharaoh's agents could not see. The persistence of traditional religion in the private sphere is one of the most telling indicators of the revolution's failure. Overwhelming and archaeologically irrefutable evidence that the pharaoh's splendid and carefully articulated theology, however magnificent in the public realm of temples and official art, had not penetrated the hearts and the homes of the ordinary people. The shrine evidence is crucial because it demonstrates, with the quiet eloquence of archaeological fact, that the pharaoh's outwardly magnificent, monumentally ambitious, politically all-powerful, and theologically all-consuming revolution never penetrated beyond the controlled and publicly surveilled sphere of official religion into the intimate, uncontrollable, and ultimately inviolable private world of individual belief. The people of Amarna went to the Aten temples, they participated in the public rituals, they lived in the pharaoh's theological city. But behind closed doors, in the privacy of their own homes, in the spaces where the pharaoh's authority could not reach, they continued to pray to the gods their parents had worshipped, to seek the protection of the traditional deities, who had guarded Egyptian households for centuries, and to maintain the religious practices that the pharaoh's revolution was supposed to have replaced. The revolutions was a surface phenomenon, a transformation of the public face of Egyptian religion that left the private reality of Egyptian belief essentially untouched. The Amarna letters, the extraordinary diplomatic archive discovered at the site in 1887, provide the most detailed and most devastating picture of the political consequences of Akhenaten's revolution. The archive consists of 382 cuneiform tablets, clay documents written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, that record the correspondence between the Egyptian court and the kings and vassal rulers of the late Bronze Age world. The bulk of the correspondence dates to the reigns of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, and the letters that pertain to Akhenaten's reign reveal a diplomatic catastrophe of the first order. The letters from the Levantine vassal rulers, the kings and princes of the city-states that constituted the Egyptian Empire in Syria, Palestine, and Canaan, are filled with desperate pleas for military assistance, reports of territorial losses, and increasingly frantic warnings that the empire is disintegrating while the pharaoh does nothing. The vassal ruler Rib-Hadda of Byblos, one of the most loyal and most articulate of the Egyptian vassals, wrote more than 60 letters to the Egyptian court, documenting the progressive loss of Egyptian influence in the northern Levant with a precision and an emotional intensity that make the abstract concept of imperial decline painfully concrete, emotionally urgent, and deeply irreducibly personal. Rib-Hadda is not a statistic. He is a voice, a human being whose world is collapsing and who writes, letter after letter, year after year, to a distant authority that has the power to save him and chooses not to act. The correspondence is one of the most poignant documents in the literature of the ancient world, a one-sided conversation that ends with the servant's abandonment and the master's silence. Rib-Hadda writes that the enemy is approaching. He writes that his allies have defected. He writes that his territory is shrinking. He writes that he needs troops, gold, grain, attention, that he needs the pharaoh to act, to respond, to fulfill the obligations that the imperial system imposes on the sovereign power. The pharaoh does not respond, or responds with vague assurances and symbolic gestures that do nothing to address the strategic deterioration that is consuming the imperial frontier. The king of Jerusalem, Abdi-Heba, wrote with similar desperation, warning that Egyptian-controlled territories were being seized by hostile forces, and that the pharaoh's military authority and political credibility in the strategically vital Levantine region were rapidly, visibly, and quite possibly irreversibly collapsing. The tone of Abdi-Heba's letters shifts over time from respectful petition to something approaching despair, the voice of a loyal vassal watching his world collapse and unable to understand why the supreme power that could save him chooses not to act. The cumulative picture that the letters from the Levantine vassal rulers paint is one of the most devastating, most detailed, and most historically instructive indictments of a ruler's incompetence in the documentary record of the ancient world. A devastating, historically documented, and diplomatically unprecedented picture of a great empire slowly and visibly disintegrating, not because it has been defeated in battle by a superior military force, but because its ruler has simply stopped paying attention. The king of Megiddo, the rulers of dozens of city-states across the Levant, all wrote with the same message. The empire is falling, the pharaoh does not care, and the loyal servants, who depend on Egyptian protection, are being abandoned to their enemies. The Amarna letters are the documentary record of an empire in decline, not because its military power had been destroyed, but because its ruler had turned his attention inward toward the construction of his magnificent but increasingly isolated theological utopia in the empty eastern desert, and had neglected the diplomatic and military relationships that had sustained the imperial system since the campaigns of Thutmose III, more than a century before Akhenaten's accession. The diplomatic catastrophe of the Amarna period was not merely a military failure. It was a failure of attention, a failure of engagement, a failure of the basic administrative competence that the management of a complex imperial system required. the system that Amenhotep III had managed with such consummate skill, balancing the competing demands of multiple great powers, managing the expectations of vassal rulers, maintaining the flow of gold and gifts and marriages that lubricated the diplomatic machinery, required constant attention, constant communication, and constant reassurance that the pharaoh valued the relationships, understood the obligations, and intended to honor the obligations that the system imposed. Akhenaten provided none of this. His attention was elsewhere, focused on the construction of his theological city, consumed by the composition of his hymns, preoccupied with the rituals and the ceremonies of the Aten cult. The empire did not collapse because it was attacked. It collapsed because it was ignored. The territories that Egypt lost during the Amarna period would never be fully recovered. The diplomatic relationships that had been maintained for generations were disrupted and, in many cases, permanently damaged. The campaigns of Seti I and Ramesses II against the Hittites, campaigns that would culminate in the Battle of Kadesh and the eventual Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, were, in a very real sense, the delayed consequences of the diplomatic neglect that had characterized Akhenaten's reign. The heretic pharaoh's indifference to the empire's external relationships did not merely weaken Egypt during his own lifetime. It set in motion a chain of strategic deterioration that would reshape the political landscape of the ancient Near East for more than a century. The role of Nefertiti in the revolution remains one of the most debated and most fascinating questions in the study of the Amarna period. The queen appears alongside Akhenaten in virtually every official representation, worshipping the Aten, receiving the Aten's rays, making offerings, and in some scenes performing actions traditionally reserved for the pharaoh alone, including smiting enemies and wearing the pharaonic crown. The degree of Nefertiti's political authority and theological significance is without parallel in the history of the 18th dynasty, and it has led some scholars to suggest that she was not merely a queen but a co-regent, a partner in the exercise of pharaonic power, whose authority and whose public visibility were nearly equal to those of the pharaoh himself. A degree of female political authority, public visibility, and institutional power that had no parallel in the 18th dynasty since the reign of Hatshepsut. The famous limestone stela, known as the Berlin family stela, provides one of the most intimate and most revolutionary depictions of the royal family in the entire history of Egyptian art. The relief shows Akhenaten and Nefertiti seated together, with three of their daughters on their laps and in their arms, beneath the rays of the Aten that descend from the solar disk and end in tiny human hands offering the Ankh, the symbol of life, to the royal couple. The scene is remarkable for its intimacy, its emotional warmth, and its complete departure from the conventions of traditional Egyptian royal art. No previous pharaoh had ever been depicted in such a casual, domestic, and emotionally expressive setting. The scene shows a family, not merely a divine couple, and the emotions it depicts, tenderness, affection, parental love, are emotions that the traditional Egyptian artistic canon had never attempted to represent, and that the traditional Egyptian theological system had never considered appropriate or even conceivable for the depiction of the divine pharaoh. The family scenes of the Amarna period are, in their own way, as revolutionary as the theology they illustrate, a visual declaration that the pharaoh is defined, and that the pharaoh's very identity is constituted not merely by his distant, formal, ritually mediated relationship to the traditional gods, but by his relationship to his wife and his children, that the divine family is also a human family, and that the emotions of familial love are not unworthy of representation in the most public and most permanent of all Egyptian media. The presence of 6 daughters and no surviving sons in the royal family has been noted by scholars as a potential factor in the political crisis that followed Akhenaten's death, the absence of a clear male heir creating a succession problem that the pharaonic system, with its emphasis on patrilineal descent and its tradition of father-to-son succession, was not well equipped to handle. The succession crisis that followed Akhenaten's death, the brief, confusing reigns of Smenkhare, Tutankhamun, and I before the military commander Horemheb seized the throne and established a new dynasty, may have been a direct consequence of the absence of a male heir, compounding the political instability that the revolution itself had created and making the restoration of the traditional order all the more urgent and all the more complete. The disappearance of Nefertiti from the historical record around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign is one of the great mysteries of the Amarna period. The queen simply vanishes, her name ceases to appear, her image ceases to be produced, and her role in the revolution appears to end without explanation. Some scholars have proposed that she died, perhaps from the plague that may have swept the ancient Near East during this period, and that some scholars believe killed several of the royal princesses as well. Others have suggested that Nefertiti was elevated rather than eliminated, that she assumed a new identity, possibly becoming the mysterious co-regent Smenkhkar, who appears briefly in the historical record during the final years of Akhenaten's reign. Recent scholarship has added another dimension to the mystery. A study published in the American Journal of Archaeology in October 2025 by Gretchen Dabbs and Anna Stevens examined the long-standing question of whether Akhenaten was affected by an epidemic, a plague that may have swept the ancient Near East during the Late Bronze Age, and that some scholars have linked to references in the Hittite and Levantine correspondence, the bioarchaeological evidence from the Amarna cemeteries, the patterns of mortality, the age-at-death profiles, the clustering of burials, has been analysed for signs of epidemic mortality, with results that remain subject to scholarly debate. The question of whether a plague contributed to the collapse of the Amarna period is part of a larger inquiry into the health and the welfare of the population that lived through the revolution, an inquiry that the modern excavations at Amarna have made possible, and that continues to reveal, season after season, new details about the human cost of the pharaoh's theological vision. The question of Nefertiti's fate remains open, and it may never be resolved because the evidence is insufficient, and the competing theories are equally plausible and equally unprovable. The mystery of Nefertiti has captivated the modern world in ways that few other ancient questions have managed, generating popular books, television documentaries, scholarly conferences, and an unending stream of speculation that reflects the modern fascination with the Amarna period, as much as it reflects the genuine difficulty of the historical and archaeological evidence. The quest to find Nefertiti's burial, a quest that has involved ground-penetrating radar surveys, DNA analysis, and the examination of unidentified royal mummies, has become one of the great archaeological dramas of the modern era, rivaling the search for Tutankhamun's tomb in its popular appeal and exceeding it, in some ways, in the complexity of its archaeological and political dimensions. The question of where Nefertiti was buried, and whether her mummy has already been found among the unidentified royal remains in the Egyptian museum collections, remains one of the most important unsolved questions in the study of ancient Egypt. The disappearance of Nefertiti coincided with, or was closely followed by, a period of catastrophe within the royal family. The Princess Akhenaten, the pharaoh's second daughter, appears to have died around the 12th year of the reign, and other princesses may have died during the same period. Some scholars have linked these deaths to an epidemic, a plague that may have swept through the ancient Near East during the Late Bronze Age, and that is mentioned in the diplomatic correspondence of the Hittite court. If the plague theory is correct, then the disappearance of Nefertiti and the deaths of the princesses may have been not merely personal tragedies, but symptoms of a larger catastrophe, a pandemic that was affecting the entire region, killing members of the Hittite royal family, disrupting trade routes, depopulating cities, and contributing to the widespread political instability that characterized the final years of Akhenaten's reign and the years immediately following his death. The final years of Akhenaten's reign are shrouded in confusion and fragmented evidence. What is clear is that the revolution was not succeeding, not by any practical measure, not by any political standard, and not by any criterion except the pharaoh's own unshakable theological conviction. The empire was deteriorating, the diplomatic system was collapsing, the domestic opposition was growing, the theological vision that had animated the pharaoh's reign was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, in the face of practical realities that the vision had never adequately addressed. And when the pharaoh died in approximately 1336 BC, after approximately 17 years on the throne, the revolution died with him, not because it was suppressed by force, but because there was no one left to carry it on. The theology of the Aten had one believer, the pharaoh who created it. When that believer was gone, the theology was gone. And now we arrive at the question that the bones in the desert cemetery and the desperate letters from the Levantine vassal rulers and the household shrines to the old gods and the empty ruins of the abandoned city all converge upon. The question that has haunted the study of the Amarna period since its rediscovery in the 19th century, and that continues to divide scholars, to provoke debate, and to resist any simple or satisfying answer. Was Akhenaten a visionary or a destroyer? The answer, and it is an answer that the evidence compels us to accept, however uncomfortable it may be, is that he was both. The visionary and the destroyer were the same man, the same mind, the same conviction, the same consuming passion for a truth that only he could see and that only he believed was worth the cost of its implementation. The great hymn to the Aten is a work of genuine, profound, and almost heartbreaking theological beauty. Heartbreaking because the beauty is real, the vision is genuine, and the tragedy of its implementation makes the beauty all the more poignant. A vision of divine unity, universal care, and cosmic creativity that anticipates, by centuries, the great monotheistic traditions of the Western world. The destruction that accompanied the implementation of that vision, the closed temples, the dismissed priests, the disrupted economy, the neglected empire, the suffering workers, the broken bones in the desert cemetery, is equally real, equally documented, and equally beyond dispute. Let that sink in. The most beautiful theology the ancient world ever produced was implemented by the most destructive pharaoh the Egyptian state ever experienced. The vision and the destruction are not contradictions. They are consequences of the same phenomenon, two aspects of the same consuming passion, two inseparable, mutually reinforcing results of the same absolute, uncompromising, and ultimately self-destructive conviction that the truth the pharaoh had discovered was so important, so fundamental, and so urgently needed that no cost was too high for its realization. The temples could be closed because the truth of the Aten made them unnecessary. The priests could be dismissed because the truth of the Aten made them irrelevant. The empire could be neglected because the truth of the Aten was more important than any political arrangement. The workers could be driven to exhaustion because the temples they were building served a god whose importance transcended any merely human consideration. The vision justified the cost. In the pharaoh's mind, if nowhere else. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the relationship between theological beauty and human welfare, and the reign of Akhenaten is the evidence. We assume that beautiful ideas produce beautiful outcomes, that the more generous the theology, the more humane the implementation, the more compassionate the consequences. The evidence of the Amarna period suggests otherwise. The most generous theology the ancient world ever produced, a theology that celebrated the Aten's care for all creatures, that marveled at the diversity of human life, that described the God's tenderness toward the unborn chick still inside the egg, was implemented by a ruler who closed the temples that fed the poor, dismissed the priests who served the community, neglected the empire that protected the vassal states, and drove the construction workers to malnutrition, injury, and early death. The theology said the Aten cared for all creatures. The implementation said the pharaoh cared only for the Aten. This is not science fiction. This is the documented, archaeologically verified, inscriptionally attested, and bioarchaeologically confirmed reality of a reign that the pharaoh's own successors, the generation that lived through the revolution and experienced its consequences, firsthand that they spent decades erasing every trace of it from the historical record. The comparison with later monotheistic traditions is illuminating, and it reveals the fundamental flaw in Akhenaten's revolution. The monotheism of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam emerged gradually, over centuries, through processes of cultural evolution, theological debate, institutional development, and community building that produced religions capable of sustaining themselves across generations and across political changes. These religions built institutions, synagogues, churches, mosques, schools, courts, charitable organizations, that could maintain the faith independently of any single political authority. These religions developed communities of believers, networks of ordinary people who shared the faith, practiced the rituals, transmitted the beliefs to their children, and sustained the religion through periods of persecution and political adversity. These religions created theological traditions, bodies of commentary, interpretation, and debate that allowed the faith to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential identity. Akhenaten did none of this. His religion was entirely dependent on a single individual, the pharaoh himself. The Aten cult had priests, but they were appointees of the pharaoh rather than members of a self-sustaining institutional tradition. The Aten cult had temples, but the temples were dependent on the pharaoh's continued patronage rather than on the accumulated endowments and agricultural estates that had sustained the traditional temples for centuries. The Aten cult had a theology. The great hymn makes clear that only the pharaoh knows the Aten, only the pharaoh understands the Aten's will, only the pharaoh can mediate between the Aten and humanity. The comparison between the institutional structures of the later monotheistic traditions and the institutional vacuum of Akhenaten's monotheism is one of the most instructive comparisons in the entire history of religion. Judaism's developed the synagogue, a community institution that could sustain the faith without a temple, without a sacrificial cult, and without a centralized priesthood. Christianity developed the church, a network of local communities, each with its own leadership, its own liturgy, and its own capacity for pastoral care that could sustain the faith through persecution, political upheaval, and the collapse of empires. Islam developed the mosque, a community institution that combined worship, education, social welfare, and communal identity in a single structure that could be replicated across cultures, languages, and political systems. Each of these institutions solved the problem that Akhenaten never solved: the problem of making a universal faith accessible to ordinary people through structures that did not depend on any single individual's authority. The entire structure of Akhenaten's revolution was built on a single point of support, and when that point was removed through the simple, inevitable, biologically certain event of the pharaoh's death, the entire structure collapsed. The significance of this analysis extends beyond the specific case of Akhenaten to the general question of how religious movements succeed or fail. The pattern that emerges is clear: the theological content of a religion, the beauty of its ideas, the sophistication of its arguments, is necessary but not sufficient for the religion's survival. What is also needed, what is indispensable, is an institutional structure that can transmit the theology across generations, sustain it through adversity, and adapt it to changing circumstances. The great hymn to the Aten is theologically comparable to the greatest religious texts of the Western tradition. The Aten cult is institutionally comparable to nothing, a structure so inherently fragile, so structurally vulnerable, so entirely dependent on a single mortal individual's continued physical existence, continued mental acuity, continued political authority, and continued personal determination, that it collapsed, instantly, completely, and irreversibly, the very instant that individual authority was removed through the simple, inevitable biological event of the pharaoh's death. The lesson is severe. Ideas, however beautiful, do not survive on their beauty alone. They survive on their institutions, on the organizational structures that transmit them across generations, that build communities of believers, that adapt the faith to changing conditions, and that create the social infrastructure that sustains belief through adversity. Akhenaten had an idea, a single magnificent, world-shaking idea, perhaps the most beautiful, the most theologically sophisticated, and the most intellectually ambitious theological idea that the ancient world ever produced. What he tragically, catastrophically, and fatally did not have, what he never built, never attempted to build, and perhaps never even understood the necessity of building, was an institution. And without an institution, the idea died with the man who held it, died completely, comprehensively, and so permanently that it took 3,000 years, more than 100 generations of human beings, living and dying and forgetting, for the archaeological evidence to bring it back from the oblivion to which the pharaoh's successors had consigned it. The failure of Akhenaten's monotheism to survive its founder is one of the most instructive case studies in the history of religion, and it offers a lesson that every subsequent religious innovator, every subsequent political revolutionary, and every subsequent visionary leader has had to learn, usually at great cost. The lesson is that the creation of a new faith requires more than a new idea. It requires a new community, a new institution, a new set of organizational structures that can sustain the idea across generations and through the inevitable periods of adversity, opposition, and doubt. The great monotheistic traditions of the Western world did not succeed because their ideas were more beautiful than Akhenaten's. They succeeded because they built institutions that were more durable than Akhenaten's. They built communities of believers who sustained the faith independently of any single political authority. They built organizational structures that transmitted the faith across generations. They built theological traditions that allowed the faith to adapt and evolve. They built, in short, everything that Akhenaten did not build. Everything that the pharaoh's exclusive focus on his personal relationship with the Aten prevented him from building, everything that the revolution's fundamental, structural, and ultimately fatal dependence on a single mortal individual's personal authority, personal resources, and personal survival made unnecessary, even inconceivable, during the pharaoh's lifetime, and permanently and irrecoverably impossible after his death. The speed with which the revolution collapsed after Akhenaten's death is itself evidence of the revolution's institutional fragility. The traditional Egyptian religion, the religion that Akhenaten had tried to destroy, had survived the second intermediate period, the Hyksos invasion, the political chaos of the late 13th dynasty, and countless other crises that had threatened the political stability of the Egyptian state. The religion had survived because it was sustained by institutions, by temples, priesthoods, theological traditions, and communities of believers that existed independently of any single pharaoh's authority, and that could maintain the faith through periods of political disruption, economic hardship, and military defeat. Akhenaten's extraordinary and theologically sophisticated religion could not survive, could not outlast by in a single generation the loss of its founder, because it had none of these institutional resources, no independent temples, no self-sustaining priesthood, no theological tradition that could adapt and evolve, no community of believers who could sustain the faith through adversity. The revolution was a magnificent structure built on a single point of support, and when that point was removed, the structure did not gradually weaken or slowly erode. It collapsed instantly, completely, and with a finality that left no institutional remnant, no continuing community, and no surviving tradition that could carry the Aten's worship forward into the next generation. The contrast with the traditional religion is devastating. The temples of Amun that Akhenaten had closed were reopened within a few years of his death, reopened with a speed and enthusiasm that suggests the population had been waiting eagerly for the restoration, counting the days until the old gods could be worshipped openly again, and the old rituals could be performed without fear. The priesthood that had been disbanded was reconstituted, its members restored to their offices, its revenues refunded, its institutional structure rebuilt. The festivals that had been cancelled were revived, their processions resumed, their music renewed, their offerings restored. The entire institutional apparatus of the traditional religion, an apparatus that had been built up over more than 15 centuries, and that the revolution had attempted to destroy in less than 2 decades, was restored to full functionality within a generation of Akhenaten's death. The traditional religion survived the revolution because it had institutions. The revolution died because it had none. We have followed Akhenaten across the full arc of his extraordinary, devastating, and endlessly fascinating reign, from the golden age of his father to the abandoned city of his death, from the magnificence of Malkata to the ruins of Amarna, from the wealth and stability and theological confidence of the 18th dynasty at its peak to the closed temples, the neglected empire, and the broken bones of the workers who built the pharaoh's theological utopia in the desert. We have seen the theology, the great hymn to the Aten, with its vision of universal divine care and cosmic creativity. We have seen the destruction, the closed temples, the disrupted economy, the suffering population, the deteriorating empire, and we have seen the aftermath, the systematic erasure of the pharaoh's memory, the restoration of the old gods, the return to the theological traditions that the revolution had tried to destroy. What does this story mean? It means that vision without wisdom is not enlightenment, it is destruction. The distinction is crucial, and the reign of Akhenaten illustrates it with a clarity that should disturb anyone who has ever been tempted to admire a leader for the beauty of his ideas without examining the consequences of their implementation. Akhenaten's theology was beautiful, his hymn was magnificent, his vision of divine unity was centuries ahead of its time, but the implementation of that vision, the closing of the temples, the disbanding of the priesthood, the erasure of the old gods, the neglect of the empire, the imposition of a personal theology on an unwilling population was catastrophic. The vision was the pharaoh's gift to the world. The catastrophic implementation was the pharaoh's failure and Egypt's tragedy. And the lesson that the ruins of Amarna and the bones of its workers teach to every generation that contemplates them is that the beauty of an idea is not a sufficient justification for the cost of its implementation. A lesson that the bones in the Amarna cemetery, the desperate letters from the Levantine vassal rulers, and the household shrines to the old gods all teach with the cold, irrefutable authority of archaeological evidence. The reign of Akhenaten is, in this sense, a case study, perhaps the earliest, certainly the most archaeologically documented, and arguably the most instructive in the dangers of visionary leadership. A warning that the qualities that make a leader capable of imagining a better world are not the same qualities that make a leader capable of governing the existing one, and that the substitution of vision for competence, of theological brilliance for administrative wisdom, and of personal conviction for institutional responsibility produces not enlightenment but catastrophe. Akhenaten was a theologian of genius. The great hymn to the Aten is proof of that, but he was a governor of catastrophic incompetence. The Amarna letters, the skeletal evidence, and the restoration stela are proof of that. The genius and the incompetence were not contradictions. They were complementary aspects of the same personality, two consequences of the same consuming passion for a truth that left no room in the pharaoh's mind for the practical demands of governance, the welfare of ordinary people, or the preservation of the institutional infrastructure that made civilized life possible. It means that institutions matter more than ideas. The temples of Amun that Akhenaten destroyed were not merely houses of worship, they were economic engines, employers of thousands, distributors of food and resources, centers of education and culture, anchors of community identity, and providers of social services that the state itself could not replace. The priests of Amun were not merely religious functionaries. They were administrators, managers, educators, and guardians of institutional knowledge whose expertise was essential to the functioning of the Egyptian state. When Akhenaten destroyed the temples and disbanded the priesthood, he was not merely changing the object of worship. He was dismantling the institutional infrastructure that sustained the civilization he was supposed to govern. The revolution was an act of institutional vandalism, the destruction, in the name of theological purity, of the very institutions that made civilized life in the Nile Valley possible. The parallel with the modern world is uncomfortable and instructive. Every civilization, every nation, and every society that has experienced a comprehensive, ideologically driven, revolutionary upheaval, every civilization that has attempted to sweep away its accumulated institutions in the name of a purer, more rational, more ideologically consistent social order, every society that has attempted to sweep away its existing institutions in pursuit of a purer, more rational, more ideologically consistent social order has discovered, at terrible cost, that the institutions it destroyed had been performing essential functions that the revolutionary ideology was neither designed, nor equipped, nor philosophically inclined to replace. The French Revolution destroyed the Ancien regime and produced the Terror. The Russian Revolution destroyed the Tsarist state and produced the Gulag. The Chinese Cultural Revolution destroyed the traditional social order and produced famine and chaos. In every case, the revolutionaries destroyed institutions that they considered corrupt, irrational, or oppressive, only to discover that those institutions had been performing essential social, economic, and administrative functions that the revolution had no mechanism, no institutional capacity, and no ideological framework to fulfill. The pattern is universal, and it is as relevant to the modern world as it is to the ancient. The reign of Akhenaten also raises profound questions about the nature of historical memory and the power of institutional authority to shape the record of the past. The erasure of Akhenaten, the systematic removal of his name, his images, his temples, and his reign from the historical record of the Egyptian state, was one of the most successful, the most thorough, and the most historically consequential campaigns of organized historical censorship and institutional memory destruction in the entire recorded history of human civilization. For 3,000 years, the most radical religious revolution in the ancient world was effectively unknown, not because the evidence had been destroyed, the desert had preserved it, but because the institutional authority of the Egyptian state had decreed that the revolution had never happened, and subsequent generations had accepted that decree without question. The success of the erasure raises its own disturbing questions about how much of human history has been lost not to the passage of time, but to the deliberate decisions of the powerful, about how many other chapters of human experience have been erased as thoroughly as the chapter of Akhenaten, and about whether the historical record as we know it represents a complete picture of the human past, or merely the picture that the survivors, the victors, the institutional authorities, and the keepers of the official record chose to preserve. A picture that may be as much a product of deliberate selection, deliberate omission, and deliberate erasure as it is of the natural processes of decay and forgetting. The Amarna period teaches us that historical memory is not a passive process. It is an active one, shaped by the decisions of the powerful, the interests of the institutions, and the politics of remembrance and forgetting that every civilization practices, whether consciously or unconsciously. The erasure of Akhenaten was a deliberate act, a decision made by specific individuals, executed by specific institutions, and sustained by specific political interests that found it advantageous to pretend that the most radical chapter of Egyptian history had never occurred. The discovery of Amarna, the recovery of the erased chapter, was also a deliberate act, the product of specific archaeological decisions, specific research programs, and specific scholarly traditions that valued the recovery of the past over the convenience of the present. The tension between erasure and recovery, between forgetting and remembering, between the institutional desire to control the historical record and the scholarly desire to recover what has been lost. This tension is not merely an academic concern. It is a moral one, a question about who has the right to decide what is remembered and what is forgotten, who has the authority to shape the historical record, and what obligations the present owes to the past, and what consequences follow when those obligations are ignored, evaded, or deliberately violated. The erasure of Akhenaten was, by any standard, a successful act of historical censorship, and its success should disturb anyone who believes that the truth of the past has an inherent right to be known, regardless of the political interests that might be served by its suppression. Akhenaten's revolution was no different in its fundamental dynamic, only in the scale and the context of its destruction. The restoration stela of Tutankhamun, erected at Karnak after the boy king reversed the Etanist revolution and restored the traditional religion, provides the most eloquent surviving testimony of the Egyptian establishment's response to the crisis that Akhenaten had created. The stela describes an Egypt in chaos, a land where the temples had fallen into ruin, where the gods had turned their backs on the country, where prayers went unanswered and military expeditions failed. The language is not merely political, it is theological, a declaration that the Amarna revolution was not merely a political mistake, but a cosmic catastrophe, a violation of the fundamental order of the universe that had brought divine punishment upon the land. The stela then proudly proclaims that the young, devout, and traditionally minded Pharaoh has restored the old gods to their rightful places, reopened the temples, refunded the priesthoods, and returned Egypt to the path of Ma'at, the cosmic order that Akhenaten had disrupted, and that Tutankhamun, still a child when he ascended the throne, still a boy king who may or may not have understood the full significance of the revolution he was reversing, was restoring with all the authority and all the resources of the pharaonic state. The Restoration Stela is one of the most important documents in the history of ancient Egypt, and one of the most underappreciated. The Stela describes, in language that is simultaneously political and theological, the consequences of Akhenaten's revolution, as experienced by the generation that immediately followed it. The temples were in ruins, the priesthoods had been disbanded, the gods had turned their backs on the land, military expeditions had failed, prayers went unanswered, the social order had been disrupted, the economy had deteriorated. The language of the Stela is not the language of mere political dissatisfaction. It is the language of civilizational trauma, the testimony of a generation that had lived through a catastrophe, and that was determined, at any cost, to ensure that such a catastrophe never happened again. The measures that Tutankhamun and his advisors took to reverse the revolution were comprehensive. The temples were reopened. The priesthoods were restored and refunded. The cult statues that had been removed or desecrated were replaced with new images of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and every precious stone. The festivals that had been suspended were revived. The offerings that had been redirected were restored. The entire institutional infrastructure of the traditional religion, the temples, the priests, the rituals, the festivals, the economic systems, the social services, was rebuilt from the ground up with a thoroughness that suggests both the depth of the damage that the revolution had caused and the determination of the restoration to leave no element of the old system unrepaired. The erasure of Akhenaten's memory that followed the restoration was remarkably thorough and remarkably successful. The pharaoh's name was chiseled from every monument where it appeared. His temples were torn down. His city was abandoned. His reign was excluded from the official king lists, the Egyptian equivalent of being removed from the historical record altogether. The erasure was not merely punitive, it was prophylactic, a vaccination against the recurrence of the disease. By removing Akhenaten from history, the pharaoh's successors were making it impossible for any future ruler to cite the heretic as a precedent, to argue that radical theological change was within the pharaoh's legitimate authority. The erasure was an act of institutional self-defense, the Egyptian state's immune response to the most dangerous threat it had ever faced, and the erasure lasted 3,000 years. 3,000 years of silence, 3,000 years of forgetting, the most radical religious revolution in the history of the ancient world, a revolution that had convulsed the most powerful civilization on earth, that had closed the greatest temples, disbanded the wealthiest priesthood, relocated the capital, and challenged the fundamental theological assumptions of a 3,000-year-old culture, was simply erased from human memory. The erasure raises its own questions about the fragility of historical memory, about the power of institutional authority to shape the record of the past, and about how much of human history has been permanently lost not to the passage of time, but to the deliberate and organized act of forgetting. It is late. The desert at Amarna is dark. The limestone cliffs that frame the site are invisible against the sky, and the ancient ruins of the city that Akhenaten built for the worship of his singular god are indistinguishable from the sand that covers them, the same sand that covered them for 3,000 years before the archaeologists came with their trowels and their brushes and their patient, methodical determination to recover what the pharaoh's determined and methodical successors had tried, with chisels and hammers and the systematic labor of state-employed workers, to permanently and irrecoverably erase. So here is the answer to the question we began with. What kind of pharaoh was Akhenaten, and what does his reign tell us about the relationship between beautiful ideas and human welfare? He was a man, a complex, contradictory, deeply flawed, and endlessly fascinating man, who genuinely, sincerely, and with all the considerable and historically documented power of his extraordinary theological intellect, saw something that no one else in his kingdom could see. A vision of divine unity, of cosmic beauty, of the sacred light that sustains all life. The great hymn to the Aten remains one of the most extraordinary expressions of religious devotion in the literature of the ancient world. A text that speaks, across 34 centuries, of a relationship between the divine and the human that is intimate, personal, and filled with genuine wonder. The vision was real and as vivid as the light of the Egyptian sun itself. The faith was sincere as any faith that has ever animated a human heart or consumed a human mind. The theology was, in its essential elements, generous, universal, and centuries ahead of its time. But the man who held the vision was also a pharaoh, a sovereign, a head of state, a ruler with responsibilities that extended beyond the realm of theology into the realm of governance, diplomacy, economic management, and the basic obligation to sustain the welfare of the people he was supposed to serve. In these responsibilities, Akhenaten failed, comprehensively, catastrophically, and with consequences that would be felt across the ancient world for generations. The temples were closed, and the communities they sustained were disrupted. The empire was neglected, and the vassal states that depended on Egyptian protection were abandoned. The workers who built the pharaoh's utopia were driven to malnutrition and early death. The people whose gods were taken away endured the loss in silence and returned to the old gods the moment the pharaoh's coercive authority was finally and permanently removed by his death. The city of Akhenaten was abandoned within a few years of the pharaoh's death. The population drifted away, back to Thebes, back to Memphis, back to the familiar cities and the ancient villages and the beloved communities where the old temples were reopening their sacred doors. The old priests were returning to their offices. The old festivals were being revived, and the old gods were being restored to their rightful positions, and the old gods were being restored. The city that had been built in 3 years was empty in 5. The desert moved in. The sand covered the streets, the painted plaster peeled from the walls, the temples crumbled, and the mud brick houses where the ordinary people had lived, and the desert cemeteries where the ordinary people had been buried were left to the silence and the heat and the slow, patient work of time. The bones in the cemetery tell the truth that the hymns do not. They tell the story of a revolution that was imposed from above, sustained by force, and endured by a population that was not consulted, not persuaded, and not cared for. They tell the story of children who were malnourished, and adults who were overworked, and families who buried their dead without the comfort of the traditional rituals that the pharaoh's theology had taken away. They tell the story of a gap, a vast, unbridgeable gap, between the beauty of an idea and the reality of its implementation, between the tenderness of a theology that celebrated the Aten's care for all creatures and the brutality of a political system that drove the creatures in its care to exhaustion, injury, and early death. The Nefertiti bust still stares from its case in Berlin. 34 centuries of calm beauty, 34 centuries of that serene, knowing, almost otherworldly composure that has captivated every human being who has ever stood before it. The bust survived the revolution, survived the erasure, survived the 3,000 years of silence, survived the modern controversies over its ownership and its display. It survives because the sculptor who carved it, a man named Thutmose, whose workshop was identified by a small ivory horse blinker inscribed with the sculptor's name, found among the debris of the abandoned workshop, was an artist of extraordinary genius, and because the desert that buried his workshop also preserved it, keeping the painted limestone face intact while the city around it dissolved into dust. The sun rises over Amarna every morning, as it has risen every morning since the city was built, as it rose every morning while the city was occupied, as it continued to rise every morning after the city was abandoned and the sand covered its streets. It has risen over Amarna every morning for 3,400 years, over the ruins and the rubble and the empty foundations of a city that was built for one god and abandoned by his worshippers. The sun, the Aten itself, the very god that Akhenaten worshipped, does not distinguish between the crumbling ruins of the pharaoh's revolutionary open-air temples and the ruins of Amun's temples. The light falls equally on both. The warmth reaches both. The rays, those rays that the pharaoh depicted ending in tiny human hands, reaching down from the disk to bless the royal family, fall on the empty, abandoned, sand-covered city with the same cosmic indifference with which they fall on every other ruin, every other monument, every other memory that the human species has built and lost and built again. The dream was too beautiful, too pure, too absolute, and too uncompromising for the imperfect institutional, stubbornly traditional world it was designed to transform. Too pure for the institutional messiness of human civilization. Too absolute for the compromises that governance requires. Too personal for the institutional structures that lasting change demands. The dream was the pharaoh's gift to the world. The world was not ready to receive it. Not because the world was too primitive, too conservative, or too corrupt, but because the dream was too dependent on the dreamer, too concentrated in a single mind, and too indifferent to the institutional requirements of sustainable change. The Aten still shines. It shines on the ruins of Amarna and on the reopened temples of Thebes, on the bones in the cemetery and on the bust in Berlin, on the hymn in the tomb and on the stela of restoration, on the dream and on the wreckage, on the vision and on the suffering, on everything the pharaoh built and everything he destroyed. And somewhere in the desert, beneath the sand, beneath the rubble, beneath the foundations of a city that was meant to last forever, the fragments of the pharaoh's extraordinary, devastating, and endlessly fascinating revolution wait. They have been waiting for 3,400 years. The Talatat blocks that were torn from the pharaoh's temples and buried face down in the foundations of later buildings are still there, still bearing the painted scenes and the carved inscriptions that the pharaoh's successors tried to erase. The broken statues are still there, their faces smashed but their forms still recognizable. The household shrines to the old gods, the little images of Bez and Tauret that the workers kept hidden from the pharaoh's agents, are still there, silent witnesses to a faith that the revolution could not extinguish and that the restoration did not need to command. The dream failed, the city was abandoned, the theology was forgotten, the pharaoh was erased, but the evidence survived, as evidence always survives, as truth always finds its way back to the surface, as the desert always gives up its dead when the archaeologists come with their patience and their brushes and their determination to recover what the powerful tried to bury. The Aten still shines, the bones still speak, and the gap between the beauty of the pharaoh's vision, the universal divine care celebrated in the great hymn, the cosmic creativity that the Aten's light was said to sustain, the tender solicitude for the chick inside the egg, and the fish in the river, and the flowers that open at dawn, and the reality of the pharaoh's reign, the closed temples, the disrupted economy, the neglected empire, the malnourished children, the broken spines of construction workers, the 1/3 of the population who died before they reached the age of 15, remains, across 34 centuries of human history, across 34 centuries, the most disturbing, the most instructive, the most archaeologically documented, and the most historically consequential contradiction in the history of human civilization, a reminder that the true, lasting, and historically enforced measure of a leader, the measure that history applies, the measure that the bones in the ground enforce, but the welfare of the people he governs, and that the most theologically sophisticated, the most poetically beautiful, and the most intellectually generous theology in the world means nothing. Nothing at all. Nothing that the bones in the ground, and the letters in the archive, and the household shrines in the ruins do not contradict and refute if the bodies of the people who build its temples are broken, malnourished, injured, and dead before they reach the age of 15.